17 May 1945, Munich. In a cheap school notebook with a split spine, a 37-year-old clerk named Carl M. wrote a single line he would never dare to say aloud: "The front is now in our mouths and our files." Bombed facades, split roofs, piles of brick that made whole streets into shallow canyons. The immediate aftermath had its own grammar: short sights, short steps, short tempers. Then the explanations came. They came after, in memories and reports, in files stamped and filed again, in occupation pamphlets and police bulletins. That is how post-war life spoke. A sentence for shock, a paragraph for context, an archive for the rest. Munich had fallen to the US 7th Army on 30 April 1945. The city that called itself the capital of the movement became a grid of jeeps, checkpoints, and requisition buildings. In the first days, survival was a schedule. Curfews at night, lines in the morning, searches in the afternoon. Fear threaded through every hour. Hard to measure, practical to feel. The rubble had its workforce: women in headscarves and worn coats, Trümmerfrauen. Women of rubble. They lifted, sorted, stacked, stone on stone, hand to hand, each brick cleaned with a hammer, set aside for a future they could not yet imagine. Photographs filed in occupation reports show their lines like ant trails across the collapsed wakes of streets, moving, returning, moving again. The mathematics of reconstruction began here. It added bodies to bricks, brute knuckles to civic plans. It did not ask why bricks had fallen, it asked where to put them now. Missing names rippled through every district. A boy gone 2 years, a husband promoted to rumor, a mother lost in the last raid and never found in the registers. The arithmetic of absence was simple and cruel. Subtract a life. Check the lists. Subtract a life. Check the lists. In Karl's notebook from the Bundesarchiv stack that contains his estate, photocopies now smudged at the edges, he wrote simply, "Hermann has not written since January. I tell Lena he is delayed. I tell myself nothing." Allied orders defined the day. All persons will remain indoors after 2,000 hours. All firearms will be surrendered to the military government at once. The loss of agency translated into routines of compliance, permits, passes, requisitions. The U.S. military government filled rooms with filing cabinets as if records could impose order on a wrecked city. Perhaps they could. Denunciations and appeals arrived in the same baskets. Fear of retribution moved along the walls like a draft. In the Soviet zone to the east, retribution arrived with comprehensible fury. In the American zone, it came as forms, interviews, and sometimes arrests, automatic arrests for functionaries and political officers. Karl had been a municipal clerk, a man of forms. He knew forms were weapons as sharp as sticks. The first weeks bled into the first winter. 1945-46 came on with a thin wind. The ration cards allotted calories, not enough. Everyone said it. Allied intelligence summaries recorded it, often with attached tables. Munich, January 1946, official ration, 1,100 calories per day for non-heavy workers. The numbers had a deadly calm. The mathematics of hunger has only a few variables: bread, potatoes, fat, sugar. The deficit turned. People learned to say Hamstern, the foraging trips to the countryside, to farmers who had goods and needed cigarettes. They could not say steal. They said organize. Cigarettes became currency. A pack of Lucky Strikes was a coin. A carton was a bank. 2 cigs for 1 kilo potatoes, reads a penciled note in a black market ledger, later catalogued in the Bavarian State Archives. American, denicotinized kindness became the medium of exchange. Hunger winter. Women ground flour with coffee mills. Soup became water with accidents. Children stopped growing before their time and then resumed slowly, as if embarrassed. Karl stood in lines and studied paper. He had worked in the city office that allocated building permits. In 1933, the office had swapped layouts for loyalty oaths. In 1945, it swapped one kind of paperwork for another. He submitted to inventories of belief. He answered questionnaires with careful handwriting and calculated omissions. The thing had a name: denazification. Clean up the past with future forms. The Fragebogen was thick with questions: party membership, affiliations, donations, positions held, organizations joined. Do you know any Jews? Have you ever been in possession of a private weapon? Allied intelligence reports described them as instruments of democratic hygiene. Germans described them as traps. In the US zone alone, more than 10 million completed forms would pass through Sprechkammern, the quasi-courts that judged categories. Major offenders. Offenders. Lesser offenders. Followers. Exonerated. A 5-part moral scaffolding to carry a nation across a broken time. The mathematics of guilt lay in those categories. The mass would pool in followers and exonerated. A smaller stream would flow through lesser offenders. A few thousand would sustain the heavier labels. That curve would decide who returned to office desks. Karl was a clerk with impeccable attendance and a brown shadow. He had taken a party badge in 1937. For work, he wrote. He had signed the loyalty pledge to the leader with the rest of his unit. He had filed relocation notices for Jewish families in 1938 and 1939 without asking where relocations led. He had arranged permits for factories that made shell casings in 1943. He had obeyed the mathematics of bureaucratic momentum. In his affidavit, he wrote, "Followed orders." Persilschein. The word circulated now. A certificate of cleanliness. References from decent people. His neighbor Lena offered to write that he was never political. The pastor wrote that Karl had helped repair the church roof after the April raid. The system required testimonies streamed into impersonal channels. The Sprechkammer made notes with blunt pencils and smaller budgets. In 1947, Karl received the printed decision: Mittelufer, follower. A fine. No prison. His office could call him back when there was an office to return to. The violence of the end created new crowds. Expellees. Heimatvertriebene. Entire columns of Germans from Silesia, East Prussia, and the Sudetenland moved west with bundles and children. Bucolic names turned to travel routes on Allied maps: Kolberg, Breslau, Königsberg. Names that would be written with new alphabets. New owners would stand before their doors. The mathematics of displacement has a cold certainty. Millions expelled, millions arriving. The cities of the West received them with sympathy worn thin by scarcity. In rural Bavaria, barns became sleeping halls. Cities opened school gyms to mattresses. The municipal ordnance boards notified households of Einquartierung, compulsory lodging of newcomers. Karl's 2-room flat in Maxvorstadt took on a family of 3 from Brieg. "They are quiet," he wrote. "I give them my bed and take the floor." Obedience turned down the volume of resentment, but it remained. Food had to stretch. Jobs had to be found. The arithmetic of scarce rooms made every wall a battlement and every corridor a frontier. Occupation reports recorded the temper of these forced communities with a cool voice. Tensions observed between local population and refugees. Primary causes: housing congestion, ration distribution disputes, perceived preferential treatment. The word perceived carried most of the load. The refugees said they were true Germans, humiliated by loss and insulted by reception. The locals said they had nothing to give. No one had enough. The arithmetic was not solvable. Policy chipped at the edges. The Lassenausgleich, the federal equalization of burdens, law of 1952, promised money over decades to those who had lost property in the East. It was a commitment to fairness in a ledger that would not balance. It signaled a new state taking shape, one that paid to pacify older losses. Documents in the Bundesarchiv show case files with modest sums, scheduled repayments, and a softening of the hard glare of expropriation. It was not justice. It was a system. Contact with victims settled along the perimeters of towns. Barbed wire again. But now the wire enclosed displaced persons. Jews who had survived camps and returned to life in the most provisional sense, forced laborers from Poland, Ukraine, France, liberated POWs waiting for trains that would arrive and sometimes not. DPs were housed in places that had housed them before, but with different names. Fehrenwald, near Wolfratshausen, became a living community of Jewish survivors, its post-war life recorded in Allied photographs with careful captions that rarely captured grief. Feldafing, Landsberg, Bergen-Belsen all became DP names, a syntax of survival. German townspeople passed by the fences with curiosity that was a layman's word for shame. We did not know. It was the sentence that built the bridge between seeing and refusing. Oral histories recorded long afterward in living rooms and community centers return to that sentence like a clock. We did not know. Allied interrogations from 1945 and 1946 note it as a refrain. The majority of respondents claim ignorance of the extent of atrocities, though many admit to awareness of unfavorable conditions. What fit in the mind was curated by the mind. In October 1945, the U.S. military government organized compelled walks through Dachau for residents. A photographic report in a U.S. archive shows men and women stumbling through barracks with handkerchiefs at their noses, faces hard to read. Germans were forced to look. But the human trick is not just looking. It is accommodating the look without changing anything else. Karl wrote in 1946, "I saw the pictures in the newspapers. Piles. Bones. I closed the paper and stirred the soup. What else was there to do? The arithmetic of denial assigns nothing to courage and everything to habit. From rubble toward order." The reconstruction had no single day of birth, but 20 June 1948 is a strong candidate. Currency reform. Old notes went in boxes. Deutsche Marks arrived. The photograph in the newspaper that morning showed a smiling clerk holding bills like a fan. Shop windows began to fill, as if the glass had wanted goods as badly as citizens did. Black markets became less lucrative. Cigarettes remained currency among the stubborn and the poor, but cash regained its voice. The mathematics of trust changed overnight. Prices stabilized. Plans could be made past the end of the week. The fragility of daily life was still real, but it was no longer a permanent storm. Marshall Plan shipments added their weight to the scale. Ship after ship unloading sacks, crates, and machines. Aid catalogs listed sugar, lard, powdered milk, medicine. Later, machine tools, locomotives, and turbines. It was practical generosity, not so much forgiveness as merger. Allied intelligence summaries from 1949 onward measure not just calorie intake, but morale. General improvement in mood correlated with increased employment opportunities and visibility of consumer goods. Things were turning. Not yet the economic miracle. But the miracle was building. Karl returned to an office that had a door. The municipal government created a housing administration that rationed rooms, authorized rebuilding permits, settled disputes over square meters with the tone of a judge. He had maps again. He had lines to draw. 3 families on the 2nd floor. 1 new bathroom for 6 adults and 4 children. The arithmetic of space had rules. Wohnraumbewirtschaftung. Housing management by schedule, file, and visit. He carried a leather binder. He knocked on doors. He learned to say, "I cannot give what I do not have." He learned to say, "It is the regulation," without believing it excused anything. The new democracy formed itself as a set of bargains. The currency reform promised confidence in money. The Marshall Plan promised confidence in production. The new Basic Law promised confidence in rights. But the personnel of the old order did not evaporate. They were classified, fined, sorted. Then they were called back. Because schools need teachers, trains need dispatchers, banks need accountants, ministries need secretaries who know where the files are buried. Between 1949 and 1951, amnesties softened and then quietly resolved denazification backlogs. The 131 law repaired the pensions of civil servants who had been excused for political reasons in the early days of occupation. Numbers frowned their way into existence. How many would return, at which salary levels, with what seniority? The mathematics of stability beat the mathematics of justice. A denomination everyone understood. Occupation reports recorded the shift with precise vocabulary. Emphasis, moving from punitive to integrative policy. Allied clemency boards reviewed sentences of convicted functionaries in Landsberg prison and released dozens. Some had orchestrated crimes, others had stood near them, which is not nothing. The administrative mind has a weak spot for those who are good with paper. A former party judge reappeared as a courthouse official. A former business organizer returned to a company with a new letterhead. The new state needed competence. Justice asked for purity. The two found a compromise in the space between office chairs. Carl saw them arrive. He was careful under the new regime, he wrote of one returning superior. But he writes dates as if they were numbers for us to forget. East and West hardened into fact. The Berlin blockade, June 1948, May 1949, was a geography lesson taught with hunger and flights. Western planes delivered flour to runways that could not keep up, but still did. Children gathered around fences to watch candy fall in tiny parachutes. The airlift was logistics as romance. In West Germany, it turned the page from conquered to allied. The mechanical cadence of Dakotas and C-54s became a lullaby that whispered a political lesson. This alliance feeds you. People remembered that. The Federal Republic was declared on 23 May 1949. The Basic Law was a pragmatic constitution that looked like a promise. Elections pressed citizens into new categories. Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Liberals, left behind but not vanished. The old nationalist vocabulary, stripped of its symbols, dressed in new suits, rehearsing lines about European cooperation and middle-class dignity. The Cold War allowed old loyalties to fit into new frames. Anti-communism took the place of anti-democracy as an organizing principle. It was convenient. It was selective. It saved the country from one danger and hid another under parliament benches. Some contact with victims remained at the edge of municipal consciousness. Jewish DPs organized schools, newspapers, marriages, and departures. File photographs show wedding dances in Fehrenwald, fragile, joyous events with suits borrowed and spirits raw. German newspapers covered them with reserved language. A common refrain in oral histories from the 1950s among Germans: "We thought they would leave." Some did, some stayed. Meanwhile, memorials to Allied bombing victims went up on city squares. The dead of the firestorms were indisputably mournable because they were ours. The mathematics of commemoration gave more space to that ledger. Schoolbooks introduced the years 1933–45 as a rise and fall with emphasis on misfortune. Teachers invited compassion for the past that did not demand too much precision about who had done what. Carl's work drew lines not just on maps, but around consciences. He watched where guilt collected and where it was drained away. Victims had their own files, often under welfare. Perpetrators had their files under personnel, Ordinary people had their files under housing. The city ran on sheets and stamps. The judgment that had to be made every day was how to live with the sentences written in no spaces. The arithmetic of guilt, he wrote in 1950, is that many small sums buy stability, which we all claim to want, and a few large debts are written off as long as the ledger balances. Trümmerfrauen gave way to construction crews. The sound of chisels was replaced by the spit of welding arcs and the shouts of men above scaffolding. The smell of mildew was replaced by the smell of fresh plaster. In Wolfsburg, the Volkswagen plant reopened and filled with a mix of seasoned workers and displaced persons learning the repetition of a new kind of reliability. In Ludwigshafen and Leverkusen, the chemical companies that had once been IG Farben splintered into BASF, Hochst Bier. Each reorganized the past as a balance sheet and projected profits forward as a kind of absolution. Their managers had files too. The Spruchkammer categories trailed them like luggage. No one opened at the station. Between memory and denial lay a long corridor of silence. Families lost members and gained strangers. Men returned from Soviet captivity as late as 1955, older than their wives, younger than their grief. They arrived to children who were strangers. The arithmetic of absence and return recalculated marriages and households. "He comes home, and he is not the man I married," one woman told an interviewer in a 1980 oral history, remembering 1953. Men walked cities and recognized nothing. They looked for old cafes and found parking lots or new facades. They found their own names in office files, and the categories made them choke. Karl processed some of those returns. He issued ration cards to men who had slept in camps after the war and returned to sleep in their old beds among new rules. A heavy drinker, he noted beside one name, then scratched it out. Judgment is a reflex. Compassion is a practice. He found himself calling the same things by new names. He called police action public order. He called suspicion investigation. He called reappointment political rehabilitation. He called his own silences prudence. "I have to feed my family," he wrote in 1947, and again in 1949 when offered a raise in a section led by a man who had sackfuls of approvals under the old regime and a library of reasonable explanations under the new. Schoolbooks softened. A fifth-grade reader from 1954 in the city library had a double page on Germany after the war. It spoke of hunger, displacement, hard work, and economic renewal. It did not mention the word Jews. It did not mention extermination camps. Nuremberg was a city known for a toy fair and a medieval wall, not for courtrooms. The arithmetic of teaching was contact with parents. Teach too much, and parents complain. Teach too little, and history becomes rumor. Teachers chose quiet survival. Children learned to identify themselves with bomb damage in their neighborhood more readily than with crimes done far beyond their neighborhood. What happened to denazification? It dissolved. Spruchkammern closed. Files went to storage boxes. Judges moved on to adjudicate building disputes and divorces. Police chased petty thieves instead of big criminals they could not catch or did not want to find. The press developed appetites for scandals that did not cause too much indigestion. A government intent on NATO membership in 1955 found that too much delirium about the past made bad diplomatic cocktails. The mathematics of alliance ran on secrecy as much as memory. Redress died in committees. Some brutal men found careers in new services that now went by reputable names and collaborated with previous adversaries to chase an adversary each side found more urgent. That was the bargain, dressed as strategy. In Munich, a city of art and beer, exhibitions of modern art reopened in new halls. The theaters staged plays about betrayal and memory, but carefully. Public commemorations leaned into tears for fallen soldiers, not into names of those they had helped to fall. Pain found safe shapes to be displayed. An Allied intelligence report from 1951 includes a sentence that recurs like a baseline. General atmosphere of normalization, limited appetite for deep introspection, political stability prioritized. The language is dry. The reality it describes is not dusty. Karl visited Dachau on All Saints' Day in 1952 with his church. He watched other parishioners stand before the crematorium with bowed heads. A priest spoke about suffering and forgiveness. The words could have fit many events. He wondered if anyone then needed their words to fit what had happened there. The healthiest spoke least, he wrote that night. Healthy in that sentence meant those most able to continue without breaking. Work filled his days more than thought did. The city issued new building codes. He made sure contractors complied. He oversaw the allocation of post-war housing blocks on the city's edge, where smooth concrete lifted above fields. Families called those apartments a miracle after years of sharing kitchens. The Residents' Association met monthly to allocate cellar space and settle noise complaints. The micro-politics of stairwells replaced the macro-politics of movement. The arithmetic of domestic life finally got to use a few positive numbers. Expellee organizations organized. The Federation of Expellees held conferences, commemorations, and political rallies. Old place names were printed on banners and hung in halls. The maps of lost lands became a nostalgic atlas that archived longing and votes. Political parties promised respect, pensions, symbols. The victims of one grand eviction created a culture of grievance that did not always recognize the victims of other evictions. The human brain does not share compassion evenly. The human vote follows memory more than morality. Karl attended one event with his tenant from Brieg. He clapped in the appropriate places. He felt that knowledge itself was dangerous. Knowledge of what had been done to him. Knowledge of what had been done in his name. When the Berlin Wall went up in August 1961, it simplified many moral equations by creating a concrete symbol for East and West. The wall named an adversary daily. Newsreels showed bricks and barbed wire, then escape attempts and funerals. The wall made the new order feel like protection. It gave the old order something to point at and say, there, not here. The arithmetic of fear had a new denominator. The old crimes blurred as new dangers advanced in headlines. There were echoes. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 forced images into living rooms again. A man in a glass booth. Testimonies by the dozen. Women and men speaking with broken voices about train platforms and selections and smoke. German newspapers ran long articles, commentary that changed map coordinates to moral coordinates, at least for a few weeks at a time. There was discomfort. There was annoyance. There was also a sense of relief among those who believed that one man could carry all the weight of memory. It was an arithmetic trick of personification. If one man was the problem, then the rest were adjuncts in his project. A convenient theorem, a lie like a bandage. Karl read the papers on the tram and folded them to keep his place. He looked up at windows where families now lived in comfort relative to the dark years. He took off his hat to women his mother's age, habit more than respect. He carried his files to the office. He authorized permits to install bathtubs. He drank coffee that no longer had a different name. He said NATO and meant safety. He said Europe and meant distance from the past. He disciplined a junior clerk for misplacing a folder and recognized himself in the boy's posture of apology. Years turned. The city's center lost some of its war scars and gained a new skyline of modest ambition. Trains ran on schedule into a station with a new roof that did not leak. Children rode bicycles to schools where teachers taught English phrases about pen pals and history lessons about the 30 Years' War. The war years sat in their allotted pages, and then the class moved on. The deep learning happened at home and mostly didn't. The schools could not correct silence at the dinner table. Silence corrected schools. Sometimes a neighbor would talk too much or too honestly, usually after wine. A sentence would begin and then stop in mid-air, not because somebody objected, because someone didn't. The air simply cooled around the words. An Allied intelligence summary from 1949 noted this habit as a cultural phenomenon. Cessation of conversation at delicate topics indicates not only fear of surveillance, but fear of self-disclosure. The habit remained after the fear had less reason. People learned to protect themselves from their own sentences. Carl's later notes grew more clipped and more sore. On 16 July 1954, he wrote, "The football victory is relief." That summer, West Germany beat Hungary in the World Cup final in Bern. The miracle of Bern. The press called it a rebirth. Songs were sung. Children practiced headers in alleys. The country needed joy that wasn't expensive, and football delivered. Joy is not guilt's enemy, it is guilt's respite. The arithmetic of celebration is necessary and insufficient. He tried to teach himself how to measure his own silence without excusing it. He wrote lists of what he had done and what he had refused to do, but he wasn't sure the categories were honest. In the summer of 1941, when his cousin had visited in a uniform stitched with runes rather than eagles, he had offered him a beer in the courtyard and said nothing about where his cousin had been posted. Because he didn't want to know. Because he did. In November of 1942, when a Jewish wife on his street disappeared and her Gentile husband acquired a certain local reputation for stoicism, Carl had crossed the street. He did not tell himself why. He did not tell anyone else either. In April 1945, he threw a party badge into a canal because the judgment to which it would be offered was days away, and he didn't want to negotiate its meaning with men who did not speak his language. He did not ask what throwing symbols into water does for the dead. The city's housing files that pass through his hands tell a story in numbers that is harder than literature to read and perhaps more honest. 3 rooms, 5 occupants, recommended 2 additional rooms. Denied, no supply. Reason, limited availability. Then, a year later, approved, 1 balcony less. Appeals made, 4. Appeals granted, 1. The state was training itself to be fair. Fairness is a habit. He respected that habit. He worried about the shape of his respect. Bundesarchiv records from the 1950s and early 1960s record a state that wanted to be decent and a population that wanted to be normal. Decency is not the same as truth. Normal is not the same as healed. The archives are full of signatures whose owners are dead. Paper outlives breath. Files preserve sentences no one wanted to speak. The front is now in our mouths and our files. The line he wrote in 1945 returned to him as he stamped housing permits in 1956, as he signed off on the rehabilitation of a colleague with a suspiciously clean record in 1957, as he read a textbook on modern history from his son's school in 1958, and underlined its omissions in pencil without speaking to the teacher. He found the black and white photographs of Trümmerfrauen in an issue of a city magazine in 1960. Their faces were older than they should have been in those frames. He recognized one woman from the block where he had once lived before the raids. She had died in 1947 of an infection the post-war pharmacy could not field. He traced her smile with a finger and considered that respect is not retroactive. The gesture was his. Its meaning was unclear. Relations with ex-Berlin neighbors softened into friendships that had never needed to explain themselves at the start. The child from Brieg became a nurse. Her mother died in 1959, buried in a city cemetery without her husband. He had vanished near the Vistula in January 1945, amid the chaos of retreat and revenge. The arithmetic of history consumed entire families and did not ring their doorbells. Karl attended the burial because he had shared his rooms and bread, and thought perhaps that sharing could function as penance, though for what exact thing he could not say without provoking some private trial. He never entered politics. He voted reliably. He read the newspaper. He attended church. He minded his desk and slouched slightly, as if that did not count as posture. He told jokes about bureaucrats that he delivered like confessions. He accepted a promotion and a larger office with a better window. The city put 2 potted plants on the windowsill. He watered them and watched them thrive. He regarded this as evidence that care of any kind worked. Sometimes he dreamed of rubble and woke on his clean pillow. Sometimes he dreamed of files with blank lines where dates should be, and woke convinced something was missing that had not rotted in the ground but had never grown. Dream arithmetic is always about balance. He remembered the stamp on his Spushkammer decision, Mitläufer, follower. He thought about the oddness of a word that made him sound like a pedestrian already walking in a direction when he had in fact stood at desks and sat at tables and ordered supplies. Maybe Mitläufer was the wrong metaphor. Maybe everyone had been part of an assembly line. In 1963, when the first Frankfurt Auschwitz trial opened, German newspapers printed testimony in columns that could not be reduced to an index. Names, numbers, processes. Goods became people again in those sentences, after years of being assessed as freight. In Karl's notebook, the line he wrote next is sharper than most. I allowed unknown to stand where I knew enough to know that I knew, he wrote. There are sentences that speak to no one and are meant only to establish that they were written. The city's squares became plazas with cafes and a low hum of leisure. The energy of survival turned to gestures of display. Men wore suits cut closer to the body, and women wore hair that made statements. The air carried hints of a generation that would ask different questions and pronounce different sentences in different tones. Karl observed this and was relieved and frightened by it in equal measure. Relief that the grind he had known was fading. Fright that the silence he had lived by would be broken and would break him. He kept returning to a phrase he had once used and then distrusted. We did not know. He tried to dissect it with the tools of his trade. Knowledge is a kind of filing, he told himself. Knowing is the surge of information through a system with capacity. Denial is a deliberate blockage. The difference between the two is intent. But intent is not always conscious. The arithmetic of innocence was always going to be a lie. He did not want to be tutored by his own honesty. He wanted to manage it like a file, to open it when necessary and close it just as quickly. He read a report in 1964 about a city in the Ruhr that had dismissed a teacher for political activity during the old regime and reinstated him afterward for lack of replacement. The report included phrases he had come to recognize: unavoidable, regrettable, necessary for continuity. These are the conjunctions of compromise. They are how democracies survive transitions. They are also how guilt sleeps. He did not know which was more important. He knew both were true. He went for walks at dusk along the Isar, where the river made spots of moving light under the bridges. He liked to watch water take light as if it were also a function of administration. He thought about the year 1945 as something that had happened to him and as something he had done. He thought about faces he did not see anymore, and about the names that had moved from mouths to stone. He thought about the opening line in his notebook from that May and decided it had not aged. It had simply acquired footnotes. On 12 November 1965, he opened his notebook late at night and tried to sum the arithmetic he had learned to live by. The house was quiet. His wife's breath from the next room was an argument for gentleness. He wrote, in his old, neat hand, with the same fountain pen he had used on ration cards 2 decades earlier, the words that still felt like contraband. We adjusted to peace by counting bread and measuring runes, by tallying files and making days add up. And in counting, we decided, silently, what would not be counted. He paused. He added one more line to close the ledger he had carried since spring 1945. For me, the front line after 1945 ran through my memory and my paperwork, not across a battlefield.